September 1944, the Lorraine, France. Listen, that is the sound of tracks crushing bone. If you could have stood in those dew-soaked beet fields outside the town of Arracourt on that specific morning, the first thing you would have felt was not fear, but cold. A damp chill that sinks right into the marrow. But soon, that cold would have been replaced by the trembling of the earth. A low, rhythmic crumbling rising from the deep, shaking the pebbles on the ground and vibrating the water molecules in the air. For the soldiers of the 30-7th Tank Battalion of the U.S. 4th Armored Division stationed there, that sound was the knock of the Reaper. Because beyond the dense fog, a herd of steel monsters was roaring to life. It was the elite of the Nazi armored forces, the 113th Panzer Brigade. And in their hands, fresh off the assembly line and smelling of factory cutting oil, was the ultimate killing machine, the Panzer V, known to the world as the Panther. This is a story about the impossible. It is the story of how 5 American tanks, often dismissed as tin cans, managed to slaughter dozens of superior armored behemoths in a suffocating fog. For the next 15 minutes, forget everything you think you know about the myth of German steel supremacy. We are going to take you inside the diesel-choked, blood-stained turret of a Sherman tank to experience the battle that rewrote the textbooks of armored warfare, the Battle of Arracourt. To understand the sheer insanity of this fight, we must first look at the cards held by both sides. This was not a fair fight. On paper, it was a mismatch of suicidal proportions. In this corner, we have the German Panther G. At that time, it was the definition of perfection. A combat weight of 45 tons, frontal armor 80 millimeters thick, sloped at a revolutionary 55 degrees. Do you know what that means? It means that when an Allied shell struck it horizontally, it wasn't trying to punch through 80 millimeters of steel, but an effective thickness of 140 millimeters. To the standard American 75 millimeter short-barreled gun, this was essentially a wall of granite. Even more lethal were its claws, the long-barreled 75 millimeter KWK velocity gun. Even at 2,000 meters to kilometers away, this gun delivered enough kinetic energy to tear through any Allied tank like wet paper. The German sights used high-grades isoptics, clear enough to let you read the brand of cigarettes an enemy tanker was smoking from a mile away. In open country, a single Panther could theoretically pick off Allied tanks, one by one, like ducks in a shooting gallery, long before the Americans could even get into range. And in the other corner, the American M for Sherman. Yes, the tank grimly nicknamed by German soldiers as the Ronson Lighter. Light's first time, every time. Its side armor was pitifully thin, barely 30-8 millimeters, vulnerable even to infantry anti-ank rockets. Its gun was like using a straw to stab a stone. There was a desperate joke circulating among American crews: to kill one Panther, you needed 5 Shermans. To the guy in the front as bait, to the guy on the sides to draw fire, and the last one to circle around the back, press its gun against the exhaust, and pray to God the shell didn't bounce. On the morning of September 19th, 1944, that desperation was about to become reality. General Patton's Third Army had advanced to fast supply lines, stretched tight as piano wire. The 4th Armored Division was out on a limb. Facing them was a revenge for assembled on Hitler's direct orders. The German commander, General Hasso von Manteufel, a battle-hardened expert in armored warfare, looked at his map and sneered. He held an entire brigade of brand-new Panthers. Facing him on the Arracourt heights were scattered American defensive units. To him, this wasn't going to be a war, it was going to be a hunt. However, on this decisive morning, God was not on the side of the Germans. He sent down the fog. A fog so thick, you could almost chew it. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters instantly. For the Panther tanks, designed for long-range sniping, this was like blindfolding a sniper and shoving him into a phone booth. Their range advantage evaporated instantly. At 8 in the morning, the metallic clatter of tracks slapped against the mud. The vanguard of the 113th Panzer Brigade, 12 fully loaded Panthers, groped their way along the muddy tracks near Le Zey. Their commanders popped their heads out of the hatches, staring nervously into the white void, static hissing in their headsets. They knew the Americans were close, but they didn't know where. Just then, a scout from the US 30-7th Tank Battalion's C Company, peering through the dripping bushes, saw the terrifying silhouettes. "Big boys. Repeat, big boys." The voice on the radio was terrified but controlled. The Americans did not run in panic. Instead, they displayed the most terrifying quality of this unit, industrial coolness. They didn't charge out like knights in a joust. They immediately called upon the true god of this battle, artillery. Miles away, the American Fire Direction Center exploded into activity. There was no smoke here, only the slide of calculation rules and the recitation of coordinates. The Americans had perfected a terrifying tactic called time on target. Through precise mathematical calculation, artillery pieces of different calibers, firing from different distances, timed their shots. They timed them so that every single shell would land at the exact same second. Seconds later, the sky was torn apart. Not a few shells, but the combined wrath of 12 artillery battalions, 140 for heavy guns, dumping tons of high explosives onto the German assembly area in a single heartbeat. Imagine the scene. The earth boiled instantly. While the Panthers' heavy armor could withstand direct fire, they were vulnerable to this rain of indirect steel. Shockwaves shattered periscopes, shrapnel sliced through external radio antennas like razors, and tracks were blown apart. More terrifying was the psychological shock. In that instant, the disciplined German attack formation shattered into chaos. Tankers instinctively buttoned up their hatches, trapped in steel coffins, while the world outside turned into thunder. Smoke and dust mixed with the morning fog, making visibility even worse. And in those chaotic few minutes, the American Shermans made their move. It was like a lightweight boxer slipping inside the guard of a heavyweight champion who had just been blinded by flashbulbs. At the center of this melee was Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the man whose name would later adorn the modern American M1 main battle tank. He was a tactical genius with a simple, ruthless philosophy. Full speed ahead. Get close. Hit them in the ribs. At ranges of less than 800 meters, a platoon of American Shermans collided head-minus on with superior numbers of Panthers. This should have been a death sentence. At this range, a Panther's 75mm gun only needed to hit once to turn a Sherman into a burning wreck. But in this life-or-death moment, a single technical detail, often ignored by casual history buffs, decided who lived and who died. That detail was turret rotation speed. Close your eyes and imagine this. You are sitting in a 45-ton Panther. Suddenly, the fog on your left parts, and an American Sherman bursts out only 150 meters away. You scream into the intercom. Traverse left. Target 9 o'clock. Your gunner frantically cranks the heavy hand -wheel. Yes, the German hydraulic drive was notoriously unreliable at no engine or PMIS. For fine tuning or ambush, the gunner had to rely on manual power. That massive turret took a full 60 seconds to rotate 360 degrees. In that minute, you are helpless, watching the green shape close in, watching the black hole of its barrel swing towards you. In combat, that minute is an eternity. Inside the Sherman opposite you, the American gunner simply flicks a hydraulic joystick. Accompanied by the sharp, beautiful whine of the hydraulic motor, says T. The Sherman's turret snaps around like an owl, completing a full 360-degree rotation in less than 15 seconds. This is the difference between fast and slow. This is the boundary between life and death. Lieutenant William White, commanding a Sherman, moved like a lethal dancer. Using the Sherman's superior low-speed torque, he surged from behind a small knoll in the mist, running straight into the Panthers trying to turn their guns. The German turrets were still slowly grinding around, sluggish giants caught off guard. Dwight didn't hesitate. AP. Fire. C-L-A-N-G. The first 75mm shell left the short barrel with an angry bark, slamming into the side of the first Panther. That was the Panther's only weak spot, 45mm of vertical armor. This time, no ricochet, no miracle. The shell drilled straight into the ammunition rack. After 1 second of dead silence, the massive Panther tank bloated outward like an overfilled balloon and detonated from the inside. A massive fireball erupted, lifting the multi-un turret into the air. But the fight wasn't over. The second Panther's gun was almost on him. Dwight could feel the death radiating from that black barrel. Diver, reverse, hard. The Sherman's driver stomped on the gas. The foggy AV-8 engine screamed, and the tank jerked backward. In that split second, a German armor-piercing shell screamed past the Sherman's front plate, carving a groove in the steel, and showering the crew with sparks, a screech of metal on metal loud enough to shatter eardrums. Before the German could reload, another American tank burst from the flank. It was perfect coordination. On the radio net, American crews called out targets, hunting the elephants like a pack of wolves, tearing at the steel beasts from their blind spots. In this furious encounter lasting only minutes, the vanguard of the 113th Panzer Brigade was devastated. The expensive, finely crafted Panthers were left paralyzed in the mud. Some had tracks blown off, spinning in circles. Others had engine X pierced, venting black and red flames. Still others sat silent, the crews inside killed by concussion, engines idling in a mournful drone. But the Germans were not done. As the sun climbed higher, the fog began to lift. This was bad news for the Americans, as visibility meant the Panthers' range advantage would return. The Germans massed a full 30 Panthers on Hill 265 for a do-or-die charge. This time, they learned their lesson, spreading out in a wide frontal formation to maximize their firepower. The ground trembled as 30 long-barreled guns, like the scythes of the Reaper, leveled at the isolated American positions. Facing this tidal wave of steel, what did Captain Spencer of C Company have? 7 operational Shermans. 30 against 7. Was this suicide? No, it was a trap. Captain Spencer made a wildly bold decision. He didn't stand and fight in the open, nor did he retreat. He used the rolling terrain, hiding his tanks on the reverse slope of a ridge. This is the classic hull-down tactic. Only the turretin optic speaking over the dirt. The Germans advanced cautiously. At this distance, they could barely see the cocky colored American tanks. Just as the German herd crested a gentle rise, exposing their vulnerable lower glacis plates, Captain Spencer grabbed his radio mic and roared the order, "Fire!" Instantly, 7 guns spoke in unison. Because it was a pre-sighted ambush, the Americans had the range dialed in perfectly. The first volley was terrifyingly precise. 2 lead Panthers were hit instantly. One had its driver's vision block punched through, sending the tank careening out of control like a mad bull, crashing into its wingman. But it wasn't enough. There were too many Germans. The remaining 20-plus Panthers halted and began to return fire. The air was instantly filled with the high-pitched shriek of high-velocity shells tearing through the air. Every round that slammed into the ground around the Shermans threw up geysers of dirt to stories high. One of Spencer's tanks took a hit. A hole the size of a dinner plate punched through the turret side, black smoke billowing out. Seeing his line about to break, Spencer played his second ace. Smoke. White phosphorus. All units fired WP. The Sherman carried not just armor-piercing rounds, but white phosphorus shells. This terrifying chemical burns violently upon contact with air and creates a dense, opaque white wall. Several WP rounds burst, right in front of the German formation. Instantly, the battlefield was bisected by a wall of white. The German gunners were blind. Their sights showed nothing but milk. Panic set in. They didn't know where the enemy would come from next. "Now, charge!" Spencer shouted the order of a madman. Under the cover of the smoke, the remaining Shermans actually charged out of their cover. They slipped like ghosts around the edge of the smoke screen, using their high speed to flank the German line. During this maneuver, the Sherman's gyro stabilizer performed a miracle. Though primitive by modern standards, it allowed the gun to stay relatively level while moving at low speeds. The Germans, by contrast, had to stop to fire accurately. And so, the impossible happened: Shermans firing on the move, drifting around the smoke, hammering rounds into the German flanks. It violated every shooting doctrine of the time, but it worked. In the confusion, the Germans couldn't tell how many American tanks there were. They felt surrounded by fire. This was not just a victory of courage, it was the payoff of rigorous training. The American Armored School didn't emphasize dueling, they emphasized fighting like machine parts in a precision engine. Every commander knew how to use terrain, every loader could maintain a reload speed of 1 shell every 4 seconds, even while bouncing over rough ground. As the sun set, Hill 265 had become a graveyard of tanks. Burning wrecks illuminated the night sky, and the air reeked of burned rubber and seared flesh. The day's fighting was over. The data showed the Americans had broken a massive German offensive at the cost of only a few tanks. But the real nightmare for the Germans was just beginning. Because the next day, September 21st, the sky cleared. If you asked a German anchor in World War II what he feared most, he wouldn't say a Sherman or even a Soviet Stalin tank. He would point a trembling finger at the sky. That was the domain of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Pilots from the U.S. 19th Tactical Air Command, flying these single-mine ascension beasts weighing 7 tons, were already circling in the clouds. Every P-47 carried 5-inch HVA, or high-velocity rockets, and 500-pound bombs. Even their 8.50 caliber machine guns, raining fire onto the thin top armor of a tank, were enough to turn the crew inside into jelly or pierce the engine deck and ignite the fuel. What made the Germans despair was the American air-ground coordination system. Inside the American tank columns, riding in a Sherman, sat a special guest, a forward dare controller from the Army Air Forces. "See the clump of bushes by the barn? I've got 2 damn big cats in there. Copy that, cowboy. If you can't handle watch this." Conversations like this filled the airwaves. Then came the sound, a shrieking scream like hundreds of bed sheets being ripped apart at once as the P-47s dove. For the Germans on the ground, it was a 1-sided slaughter. Just as a German tank exposed itself in the open, huge 5-inch HVA, or rockets, trailed fire and smoke, slamming down with pinpoint accuracy. These rockets were originally designed to sink warships. Using them on tanks was like using a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. BOOM! A massive explosion, and the turret of a Panther was flipped dozens of meters into the air. Even a near miss was lethal. The shockwave from a rocket exploding meters away would ring the tank like a bell, shaking the 45-ton beast off the ground. The crew inside would suffer ruptured internal organs or shattered eardrums instantly. In that moment, 80 millimeters of frontal armor meant nothing. Sloped angles meant nothing. Against vertical death from the sky, the Panther was as helpless as an infant. Survivors tried to reverse into the woods, but the Americans had closed the loop. You want to hide in the trees? The P-47s dropped napalm, turning the forest into an inferno. You want to stop and shoot at the planes? The flanking Shermans would blow your tracks off. This wasn't combat anymore, it was an industrial assembly line of destruction. But if you think that was the full extent of the American hand, you underestimate this warm machine. In the days following September 21st, another lethal player entered the game, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the M18 Hellcat. If the Sherman was a tough brawler, The M18 Hellcat was an assassin with a stiletto. It was the fastest tracked vehicle of the war, capable of hitting 80 kilometers per hour. It had almost no armor. It was open minus stopped, the crew exposed to the air, but it carried a high minus velocity 76mm gun capable of punching through a Panther's side at long range. Let's zoom in on the classic ambush of September 27th. On that day, the Germans tried one last surprise attack. They thought the American line was soft. They didn't know they were walking into a kill zone. A platoon of Hellcats commanded by Lieutenant Edwin Leeper lay silent, like ghosts on the edge of the Arracourt forest. Engines off, camouflage nets up, cold guns pointing forward. As a dozen Panthers rumbled past, the Germans couldn't hear the assassins. The Germans made a fatal mistake, eyes front, completely ignoring the silent tree line on their flank. Let them pass. Wait. Fire. With a crack, the M18 76mm guns opened up. This was a rapid minus-fire assault. The first round drilled through the engine deck of the lead Panther. Within 10 seconds, the second, the third, it was a massacre. The M18s used their incredible speed to shoot and scoot, fire around, relocate. By the time the lumbering Panther turrets slowly rotated toward the muzzle flash, there was nothing there but broken saplings. The Hellcat was already hundreds of meters away, firing into the rear of another tank. In 12 minutes, remember that, just 12 minutes, Leeper's platoon destroyed 8 Panthers. And the American losses? Daro, not a single M18 was hit. They turned armored warfare into a game of cat and mouse. Only this time, the mouse had a poison needle. As time dragged on, the nature of the battle shifted. If the first few days were decided by tactics and courage, the days after September 25th became a brutal war of resources. And this is where Nazi Germany truly lost the war. On the other side of the Arracourt battlefield, a very different scene was playing out. It was the Battle of Logistics. The Germans were facing an enemy more terrifying than American shells, dry fuel tanks. General Mantefuel looked at the reports, his hands trembling. Many of his tanks weren't destroyed by the enemy, they were blown up by their own weeping crews because they had run out of gas. It was a picture of supreme irony. A Panther tank, costing hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks, the pinnacle of engineering, turned into a useless pile of scrap because of a lack of cheap diesel. In the dead of night, the German camps reeked of despair. Tankers didn't dare start engines to keep warm, they huddled in great coats, shivering, waiting for the Americans to come. Look at the American rear, however, and you see an endless artery of steel. The famous Red Ball Express was performing miracles. This army of trucks, driven largely by African-American soldiers, raced down the highways day and night. They ignored speed limits, ignored fatigue, even removed the governors from their engines. Their mission was singular: get fuel, ammo, and cigarettes to the front. At the front lines of Arracourt, American tankers didn't just have enough high-octane gasoline to drive, they had enough to wash the grease off their hands with it. While German gunners counted every shell, American Shermans were using expensive high-explosive rounds to blow up suspicious haystacks just in case. This was the crushing weight of national power. This was the force of industrialization. On September 29th, the battle saw its final curtain call. Refusing to accept defeat, General Mantefuel gathered every last scrap of strength for a suicidal general offensive. It was Germany's last gamble. Every remaining Panther, assault gun, and half-minus track was thrown in, but this played right into American hands. The sky was crystal clear, perfect hunting weather. As the German units broke cover, they found they weren't just fighting tanks, they were fighting a sky blackened by aircraft. Simultaneously, every artillery piece in the 4th Armored Division, from self-propelled guns to towed howitzers, unleashed a mad fire for effect. Imagine the devastation. The ground was burning. The air was burning. The German spearhead was melted into slag before it even touched the American lines. German veterans later wrote that day, "We felt God had abandoned us." Whether inside a tank or in a crater, death was everywhere. That day, the last German counter-attack collapsed. When the smoke finally cleared, the fields of Arracourt were littered with the carcasses of hundreds of tanks. Twisted, blackened, smoking, a graveyard of steel beasts. Let's look at the cold, shocking statistics. The German 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, in just 10 days, lost almost everything. The magnificent steel army that set out was annihilated. Of 262 tanks and assault guns, only 60 remained operational. This wasn't a defeat, it was an erasure, a casualty rate of 76%. And the U.S. 4th Armored Division. They lost only 48 tanks, and thanks to the terrifying efficiency of American repair crews, many of those were fixed and back in the fight within days. A kill ratio of 3.6 to 1. That is the report card of the invincible Panther tank. This was not just a victory in a battle, it was a death sentence for an obsolete philosophy of war. The Germans worshipped the superweapon. They believed that if they built a tank with thicker armor and a bigger gun, one could defeat 10. They poured their resources into building expensive, complex, watch-minus-like killing machines. Every Panther was a work of art, but it was just that, art. The Americans, on the Lorraine Plain that September, showed the world what modern war really was. The U.S. didn't have an invincible tank. The Sherman would lose a joust against a Panther. But the Americans didn't rely on a single weapon, they relied on a massive, precise, highly efficient system. In this system, there were the pilots diving from the clouds, the artillery mathematicians calculating coordinates in the rear, and the truck drivers sleepless on the highways. The mechanics swapping tank engines in for hours, and of course, the tankers in their Shermans, chewing cigars, coordinating via radio, fighting like a Wolfpack. It was the system that defeated the lonely super tank. When Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood on his Sherman, looking out at the burning German wreckage, he saw not just the destruction of an enemy, but the dawn of a new era. From that moment on, war was no longer a duel of knights, it was a collision of systems, a direct dialogue of industrial capacity. The Battle of Arracourt was like a lightning bolt that illuminated the turning point of the Western Front. It told all who followed in the face of the steel flood of industrialized warfare. Individual heroism and singular miracle weapons are nothing but dust in the wind. Those burning Panther wrecks in the mist of September 1940 are the tombstones of that old world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the clash of armor and logistics, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. I am your strategy observer. I will see you on the next battlefield.